What if some of the most important pieces of evidence in the Idaho4 case have been hiding in plain sight? 7 iPhones introduced into the record, a 100-meter radius drawn around the King Roadhouse, and an Apple capability that wasn't publicly announced until years after the crime. Today, we're going to separate fact from opinion and examine a single question. Is there a factual basis to believe those seemingly disconnected bits and pieces could place Brian Kohberger at the King Road crime scene? To be clear, a factual basis is not proof. It doesn't establish that something happened. It simply means that there are objective, verifiable facts that could make a hypothesis worthy of serious consideration. Throughout this video, every claim will fall into one of 3 categories: an established fact, a documented technical finding, or an opinion or inference drawn from those facts. By the end, you'll have everything you need to decide for yourself whether the hypothesis rests on a genuine factual foundation or whether it doesn't. Let's begin with the technology itself. Before we can examine if the technology may have played a role in the Idaho4 investigation, we first need to establish the first factual basis. Can Apple's anti-stalking feature detect a nearby offline Android phone? The answer is yes. That is an opinion, it's fact. Apple developed anti-stalking protections after concerns that AirTags could be used to secretly track people. These protections were designed to identify nearby tracking devices and alert users when an unknown device appeared to be traveling with them. Before an iPhone can properly determine whether a device poses a stalking risk, it first has to detect that the device is nearby. According to Apple's public documentation, that detection is accomplished using Bluetooth Low Energy, commonly referred to as BLE. BLE is a beacon, which makes it a slightly different version of the Bluetooth that you use for headphones or speakers. The fact that BLE is used brings us to another technical fact. Bluetooth Low Energy isn't limited to a few feet. Under favorable conditions, BLE signals can be detected from distances approaching 100 meters. Actual range depends on the environment, but the technology is capable of operating well beyond conversational distance. That's all the technical depth that we need to know. We've established 3 facts. First, Apple developed anti-stalking technology. Second, that technology relies on Bluetooth Low Energy, or BLE, to detect nearby devices. And third, BLE can operate at distances approaching 100 meters under favorable conditions. So we've established the first factual basis around Apple's anti-stalking technology being capable of detecting a nearby offline Android phone. The next question is just as important. Did that technology exist in 2022? Most people assume the answer is no, even very technical people familiar with mobile technology. After all, it wasn't until 2024 that Apple and Google announced support for Android users to receive alerts about unknown Bluetooth trackers. For many people, that announcement marked the beginning of Apple's anti-stalking support for Android devices. But that's not the question we're trying to answer. The question isn't when Android users began receiving alerts. The question is what iPhones were already capable of doing in 2022. Those are 2 very different questions. That distinction became much more significant when a researcher working with Celebrite examined how iPhones interacted with nearby offline Android devices. According to this researcher's public findings, iPhones were logging nearby offline Android devices before Apple's 2024 announcement, and all the way back to at least February of 2022. If that research is accurate, it means that underlying detection capability predated the public rollout of lost device alerts. That doesn't tell us what happened in the Idaho4 investigation, and it doesn't tell us whether any particular phone recorded any particular device. But what it does tell us is something much narrower but critically important. There is a factual basis to believe that any iPhone was capable of logging nearby offline Android devices in 2022. The next question is no longer about Apple's technology. It's about the Idaho4 investigation itself. If iPhones were capable of logging nearby offline Android devices in 2022, the next question practically asks itself: did investigators collect evidence consistent with that capability? The case record shows that investigators collected 7 iPhones belonging to residents of the 1122 King Roadhouse. Again, that is an opinion, that's fact, By itself, that fact tells us very little. Investigators routinely collect electronic devices during these types of investigations for a variety of legitimate reasons. But it is one piece of the factual record. The second fact involves the prosecution's mobile device expert, FBI Special Agent Balance.
And then provided that drive testing in discovery. But instead of doing that, what they did was draw a 100-meter radius around the house and just block off that area and simplify it and say, his phone connected to a tower that provided coverage within 100 meters of the King Road residence. Because of this, the defense obviously tried to get Nicholas Balance's testimony excluded and failed to do so in Judge Hippler's court. He called it fodder for cross-examination.
During pre-trial proceedings, the prosecution represented that Agent Balance would provide expert testimony on mobile device evidence beyond traditional cellular site location information, or CSLI. That representation is also a fact. It doesn't tell us what conclusions Agent Balance reached. It doesn't tell us what methodology he ultimately relied on. It simply tells us the prosecution expected his testimony to extend beyond historical call tower analysis. Taken together, these facts establish the third factual basis. Standing alone, those facts don't establish why the phones were collected or what evidence they contained. But they do lead to the next logical question. Do the facts support the hypothesis? Up to this point, we've established a number of seemingly independent facts. None of those facts standing alone answer our original question. But that's not how a factual basis is established. Individual facts rarely answer important questions by themselves. It's only when those facts are considered together that the hypothesis begins to take shape. So now let's connect the dots. If iPhones were capable of logging nearby offline Android devices, and if investigators collected 7 iPhones from the 1122 King Road house, and if an offline Android device entered Bluetooth low energy range of those devices, then there is factual evidence to believe those iPhones could have recorded evidence of that encounter. Notice the wording. I'm not saying investigators relied on that evidence, and I'm not saying this establishes guilt on the part of Mr. Kohberger. I'm saying something much narrower. The facts we've established create a factual basis for the hypothesis, not because any one fact proves it, but because each independent factual basis is consistent with the same explanation. Whether that explanation is ultimately correct is a different question, and that's the question we'll answer next. What's the verdict? Of course, there are alternative explanations. Investigators could have collected 7 resident phones for some other reasons. Agent Balance's expertise beyond traditional CSLI could have had nothing to do with Apple's anti-stalking technology. The 100-meter area surrounding the King Road residence could be explained by something entirely unrelated to Bluetooth low energy. None of these possibilities can be ruled out based on the public record. But neither do they eliminate the hypothesis we've examined. Every fact we've discussed is supported by either the public record or by documented technical research. Individually, none of these facts establishes that Apple's anti-stalking technology placed Mr. Kohberger at the King Road house. Taken together, however, they establish something much more limited, but also more important. They establish that there's a factual basis for considering the hypothesis. Whether investigators actually relied on this technology, whether any of the resident phones recorded an encounter with an offline Android phone, and whether that evidence played any role in this investigation, those are questions the public record cannot yet answer. But based on the facts we've examined, this hypothesis cannot fairly be dismissed as unsupported speculation. It rests on an identifiable factual foundation. If you like my videos and how I present the information, please subscribe and like the video.